Natalie and Marcus are eagerly awaiting the birth of their first child. But when Natalie's labor takes an unexpected and dangerous turn, her pleas for help are ignored. As her pain intensifies, Marcus must fight to make the doctors listen before it's too late. This gripping story of love, fear, and the struggle to be heard reveals the deep flaws in a healthcare system that almost cost them everything. Will they be able to save each other and their baby? And what change will their ordeal spark? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories. Natalie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly. The nursery was nearly finished, a soft pastel theme running throughout the room. Pale yellow walls, a mobile of tiny birds dangling above the crib, and a bookshelf already filled with children's books. She had spent months preparing for this moment, dreaming of the day when her baby girl would arrive. But now that the day was almost here, the emotions hit her in waves: joy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of anticipation. The kick from inside her belly jolted her out of her thoughts, and she smiled, rubbing her hand over the spot where the baby had made her presence known. "She's a strong one," Natalie murmured to herself, the thought both comforting and daunting. There was so much love already growing inside her for this child, a love that had only deepened with each passing day of her pregnancy. Across the room, Marcus walked in, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over his arm. He had just come home from work, the weight of the day evident in the tiredness around his eyes. But the moment he saw Natalie, a soft smile tugged at the corners of his lips, washing away some of the exhaustion. "How's my favorite girl doing?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her cheek before resting a hand on her belly. The warmth of his touch was grounding, and Natalie leaned into him, comforted by his presence. "She's active," Natalie said, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I think she's getting impatient. I can't believe we're this close." Marcus chuckled, sitting beside her on the bed. "You've been saying that since month 7. I know, but it feels real now. Like any day could be the day." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You're going to be amazing, Nat. We've been through so much to get here, and now it's finally happening." Natalie looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. They had waited years for this moment, endured countless doctor appointments, tests, and fertility treatments that had stretched their hopes thin at times. The journey to parenthood hadn't been easy for them, and there had been many nights when they weren't sure it would ever happen. But now, their dream was within reach. "I'm just nervous," Natalie admitted, her voice soft. "What if something goes wrong?" Marcus shifted to face her fully, his hands gently taking hers. "Hey, it's going to be fine. You're strong, and we're in the best hospital. I've gone over every detail with the staff. You'll have the best care possible." Natalie nodded, grateful for his reassurance, though the anxiety still lingered at the back of her mind. She trusted Marcus. After all, as the hospital's chief operating officer, COO, he had spent the past few months making sure everything would go smoothly when the time came. But even that didn't erase her fears completely. "I know you've got everything under control," she said, squeezing his hands. "But sometimes I think about all the stories I've heard. About women, especially black women, not being taken seriously when they're in labor. I can't stop worrying about it." Marcus's expression grew serious, and he nodded. He knew what she was talking about. It wasn't just stories, it was a well-documented reality. Studies had shown that black women were more likely to have their concerns during childbirth dismissed, and their pain often downplayed. It was something that had weighed heavily on Natalie throughout her pregnancy, despite her confidence in the hospital where Marcus worked. "You won't be dismissed," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Not here, not in my hospital. I'll make sure of that." Natalie smiled at him, appreciating his support more than words could express. She knew he would do everything in his power to protect her, but there was still an unease that she couldn't quite shake. The anticipation of childbirth was one thing, but the fear of not being heard when it mattered most lingered in her mind. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I just want her to be safe." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "She will be." And so will you. They sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, letting the weight of their shared hopes and fears fill the room. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but inside their small apartment, it was peaceful. Natalie closed her eyes, imagining the life they were about to begin, the life they had dreamed of for so long. The contractions started in the early hours of the morning. At first, they were barely noticeable, just a dull ache that Natalie had felt before during Braxton Hicks' contractions. She had experienced these false labor pains on and off for weeks, and while they were uncomfortable, they hadn't been the real thing. But tonight, something felt different. The ache was deeper, more intense, and it lingered longer than usual. Natalie shifted in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but the discomfort wouldn't go away. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 2:47 a.m. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the blinds. Beside her, Marcus slept soundly, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the rising tension in her body. Another wave of pain rippled through her, and this time she couldn't ignore it. "Marcus," she whispered, nudging him gently. He stirred, blinking awake. "What's wrong?" His voice was groggy, but concern quickly filled his expression when he saw the look on her face. "I think it's time," Natalie said, her breath catching as another contraction hit her. "I've been having contractions for a while now, and they're getting stronger." Marcus was instantly alert, sitting up and throwing off the covers. Okay, let's get you ready." He moved quickly, pulling on clothes and grabbing the hospital bag they had packed weeks ago. Natalie tried to keep calm, focusing on her breathing as the contractions became more regular. She had read the books, attended the birthing classes, and watched all the videos on labor, but now that it was happening, she couldn't help the wave of nervous excitement that coursed through her. As they headed out the door, Marcus grabbed his phone to call the hospital, letting them know they were on their way. Natalie leaned against the doorframe, pausing for a moment as another contraction tightened around her belly. She breathed deeply, counting slowly as the pain ebbed and flowed. Marcus was at her side in an instant, his hand gently supporting her back. "You okay?" Natalie nodded, though the intensity of the contractions was becoming more difficult to manage. "I'm fine. It's just happening faster than I thought." They made their way down the hallway of their apartment building, Marcus steadying her as they descended the stairs. The cool night air hit them as they stepped outside, and Natalie shivered slightly, though it had nothing to do with the temperature. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Natalie gripped the armrest of the car as each contraction came and went, her body tense with anticipation. Marcus drove calmly, though she could see the flicker of anxiety in his eyes whenever he glanced over at her. By the time they arrived at the hospital, the contractions were coming regularly, and Natalie could barely walk without assistance. Marcus quickly parked the car and rushed to her side, helping her out of the vehicle and into the hospital's brightly lit lobby. The maternity wing was quiet, the low hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as they approached the reception desk. A nurse greeted them with a professional smile, her demeanor calm and efficient. "Hi, I'm Natalie Ross," Natalie said between breaths, trying to keep her voice steady despite the pain. "I think I'm in labor." The nurse, a woman in her mid-40s with neatly tied back hair, nodded and quickly entered Natalie's information into the system. "We've been expecting you, Mrs. Ross," she said, handing Natalie a clipboard with some forms to sign. "Let's get you to your room." Marcus stayed by Natalie's side, helping her as they walked down the hall toward the maternity ward. The room they were brought to was private, with soft lighting and a comfortable bed set up in the center. Natalie was grateful for the quiet. It was a welcome contrast to the overwhelming noise and motion outside. As they settled into the room, a nurse entered, introducing herself as Nurse Susan. She was professional and no-nonsense, her demeanor efficient but not particularly warm. "How are we doing, Mrs. Ross?" Susan asked, as she began checking Natalie's vitals. "I'm having regular contractions," Natalie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're getting stronger." Susan glanced at the monitor, making notes on a clipboard. "First-time moms often find labor pains more intense than they expect. We'll monitor your progress, but it could still be a while." Natalie nodded, though a flicker of discomfort passed through her at Susan's tone. She had expected more empathy, more reassurance, but Susan seemed detached, as if she had done this 1,000 times before and wasn't particularly invested in Natalie's individual experience. Marcus, sensing Natalie's unease, squeezed her hand gently. "You're doing great," he whispered. "Just breathe through it." Natalie tried to focus on her breathing, but the pain was growing more intense with each contraction. She shifted uncomfortably in the bed, trying to find a position that would offer some relief. "We'll check your dilation soon," Susan said, glancing at her watch. "It's too early for an epidural, but we'll keep an eye on things." As Susan left the room, Natalie leaned back against the pillows, her breath coming in short gasps as another contraction hit her. Marcus stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. "I'm okay," Natalie said, though her voice was strained. I didn't think it would hurt this much already." Marcus's face was tight with concern. "We'll get through this, Natty. I'm right here." But as the minutes turned into hours, Natalie's pain continued to escalate, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The contractions were relentless now, each one hitting harder than the last. Natalie gripped the sides of the bed, her knuckles white as she tried to breathe through the pain. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her heart raced with both effort and fear. She had known labor would be hard, but this felt like something else entirely. Susan had come in several times to check on her, but each time the nurse offered the same reassurance. "You're progressing. It just takes time." But time was starting to feel like the enemy. Natalie couldn't escape the growing sense that something wasn't right. Every contraction felt like her body was being ripped apart from the inside, and it was getting harder and harder to catch her breath between them. "Marcus!" she gasped, clutching his hand as another wave of pain hit. "I don't think I can do this. It feels wrong." Marcus's brow furrowed, his own anxiety mounting. He had trusted the hospital, trusted the staff, but now he was beginning to question if they were truly paying attention to Natalie's needs. He had read about labor, understood that it could be unpredictable and long, but this felt different. The fear in Natalie's voice shook him to his core. "I'll talk to Susan," Marcus said, his voice strained. "Just hang in there, Nat. I'll get her to come check again." He left the room quickly, searching for the nurse in the hallway. When he found her, she was talking to another nurse, her expression calm as ever. "Nurse Susan," Marcus called, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can you check on Natalie again? She's in a lot of pain, and she feels like something's not right." Susan glanced at her clipboard, her expression neutral. "Mr. Ross, I understand that labor can be distressing, but your wife is progressing normally. Pain is part of the process." Marcus's frustration was evident as he stepped closer. "She's telling me something feels wrong. Please, can you just check her again?" Susan sighed, clearly trying to maintain her composure, but there was a hint of annoyance in her voice. "I'll check her in a bit, but right now, everything looks fine on the monitors." Marcus clenched his jaw, but he nodded, not wanting to cause a scene. He returned to Natalie's side, his heart heavy with frustration and worry. She was in pain, and he felt powerless to do anything about it. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, brushing a strand of damp hair away from her face. Natalie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's getting worse, Marcus. I don't know how much longer I can do this." He kissed her forehead gently. "You're doing amazing. We're going to get through this. I promise." But deep down, Marcus wasn't sure how much more of this he could handle either. He had trusted the system, but now he was starting to see the cracks. And as Natalie's pain continued to escalate, he knew they were heading towards something critical. In this revised version of Part 1, the story is expanded to allow for deeper character development and an increasing sense of emotional tension. Natalie's growing anxiety about the childbirth process and her fear of not being listened to is established early on, setting up the internal conflict that will play out over the course of the story. Marcus, as the COO of the hospital, struggles with his own feelings of helplessness as he watches the system he trusted fail to fully meet his wife's needs. The tension builds as Natalie's labor intensifies, creating a sense of foreboding that sets the stage for the later climax. This version adheres to YouTube's monetization policies and U.S. law by focusing on emotional storytelling, avoiding graphic content, and centering on the universal themes of love, fear, and advocacy. Natalie could hardly keep track of time anymore. Every second felt stretched and compressed, with each contraction hammering through her body, consuming everything. The pain had gone from a distant ache to something unbearable, overwhelming her ability to focus on anything else. She tried to remember her breathing techniques, counting through the contractions like the birthing classes had taught her. But nothing seemed to help. Marcus hovered at her side, his face lined with worry as he watched her grimace and clench her teeth through another contraction. He had never felt so helpless. No amount of encouragement or reassurance could ease the pain she was feeling. And no one from the medical staff seemed to take it as seriously as they should. As another contraction ripped through her, Natalie's breath came out in short, sharp gasps. She reached for Marcus's hand, gripping it tightly, her knuckles white. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't do this. Something's wrong. I feel it. Please, get someone." Marcus's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He had tried to stay calm for her sake, but it was becoming clear that this wasn't just ordinary labor. The intensity of her pain, the way she was struggling to breathe through the contractions, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He stood up, his expression grim, and headed toward the hallway. He found Nurse Susan at the nurse's station, her eyes scanning through a chart as if everything were running as usual. "Nurse Susan," Marcus said, his voice sharper than he intended. "You need to check my wife. Now." Susan looked up, her expression mildly irritated but composed. "Mr. Ross, I've been monitoring your wife closely. She's progressing normally for a first-time mother. I understand the pain is difficult, but this is part of labor." "No," Marcus cut her off, his frustration boiling over. "You're not listening. My wife isn't just in pain. She's telling me something feels wrong. She's been saying it for hours. Please, just check her." There was a brief flicker of something in Susan's eyes. Annoyance, maybe even doubt. But it was gone just as quickly. She sighed, set the chart down, and followed Marcus back to Natalie's room, her demeanor detached and professional. When they reached the room, Natalie was curled on her side, her face pale and covered in sweat. Her breathing was shallow, and she barely had the energy to lift her head when she saw them come in. "I need you to check her dilation," Marcus insisted, watching as Susan approached the bed. Nurse Susan wordlessly began her examination, her face unreadable as she worked. The room was tense with anticipation, Natalie's labored breathing the only sound breaking the silence. After a few moments, Susan straightened and removed her gloves. "She's only about 3 centimeters dilated," Susan said, in the same matter-of-fact tone she had used earlier. "This could take several more hours." "Several hours?" Marcus's voice was incredulous. "She's been like this for hours already. She's in agony." "I understand this is difficult, but labor is unpredictable," Susan replied, her tone clipped. "It's too early for an epidural, and we don't want to intervene unnecessarily at this stage. First-time mothers often think the pain is worse than it is." Natalie, hearing the dismissal in Susan's words, felt a surge of frustration well up inside her. She wasn't exaggerating. This pain wasn't normal. It was too much, too sharp, too constant. She had read enough and spoken to enough women to know that her body was telling her something. But no matter how much she tried to explain that, no one seemed to believe her. "Natalie," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with worry as he crouched beside her. "What do you want me to do?" I don't know," Natalie gasped, tears welling in her eyes. I don't think I can take much more of this." Marcus clenched his fists, his frustration building with every minute that passed. He was the COO of this hospital. He should have been able to ensure that Natalie was receiving the best possible care, that she wasn't dismissed or ignored. But right now he felt powerless. "Can't you at least give her something for the pain?" Marcus asked Susan, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. Susan shook her head, her expression impassive. "As I said, It's too early for an epidural. We want to let her body progress naturally." Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. How much longer could Natalie endure this? How much longer could he stand by and watch her suffer, knowing that no one was listening to her? He felt trapped between the medical authority Susan seemed to wield and the love he had for his wife. A love that told him she was right. "I'm going to get another doctor," Marcus said suddenly, his decision made. "Someone needs to look at her. This isn't right." Before Nurse Susan could protest, Marcus was already walking down the hall toward the doctor's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He had to do something. It wasn't until Dr. Taylor, the obstetrician on duty, entered the room that Natalie felt the first real flicker of hope in hours. Dr. Taylor had checked in earlier, but this time there was something more urgent in his demeanor. He wasn't smiling politely or brushing off concerns. He looked concerned, serious. Marcus stood by the bed, his jaw tight, and watched as Dr. Taylor moved quickly to examine Natalie. His hands worked efficiently, but there was a sense of purpose in his actions that Marcus hadn't seen from anyone else. As Dr. Taylor reviewed the monitor readings, a deep frown crossed his face. "The baby's heart rate is fluctuating," Dr. Taylor said, his tone measured but firm. "We need to act now." Natalie's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with fear. "What does that mean? Is she okay?" Dr. Taylor turned to Natalie, his voice calm but urgent. "Your baby is in distress. We need to get you into surgery for an emergency C-section." The room seemed to freeze around her. "Surgery!" The words hit Natalie like a wave of cold water, shocking her out of the fog of pain that had consumed her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had prepared for a natural birth, spent months learning about the process, but now everything was spiraling out of her control. Marcus squeezed her hand, his voice low and steady, though his face was pale. "You're going to be okay, Natty? We're going to do whatever it takes to keep you and the baby safe." Natalie nodded, though her mind was racing. The thought of surgery terrified her, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief. Finally, someone was acting. Finally, they were listening. Dr. Taylor turned to the nurse standing nearby, issuing instructions with crisp precision. "Prep the OR. We need to move fast." The minutes that followed felt like a blur. The room filled with medical staff, the once quiet atmosphere now buzzing with urgent activity. Natalie was wheeled out of the room, Marcus by her side, his hand clutching hers tightly as they sped down the hall toward the operating room. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as they arrived at the brightly lit OR. Natalie was transferred to the surgical table, the cold air of the room hitting her skin as the team worked quickly to prep her for the procedure. The bright lights overhead made her squint, and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. "Marcus," Natalie whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. "I'm scared." "I know, baby," Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion. "But you're strong. You're going to be fine." "Our baby's going to be fine?" Natalie nodded, but the fear was overwhelming. She had never felt so vulnerable, lying there surrounded by doctors, her body no longer under her control. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Would the surgery hurt? Would her baby be okay? Would she be okay? "Doctor?" Taylor leaned over her, his voice calm but focused. "Natalie, we're going to take care of you. We'll have your baby out soon. Just hang in there." As the anesthesia began to take effect, Natalie's body started to feel numb, the pain that had consumed her for so long fading into the background. But her mind remained sharp, her thoughts still swirling with fear and hope, relief and terror, all mingling together. Marcus was asked to step back as the team began the procedure, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt completely helpless. He stood near the doorway, his eyes glued to the blue surgical curtain that separated him from Natalie and the baby. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Time seemed to stretch on forever as the team worked, the tension in the room palpable. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with what-ifs. What if the baby didn't make it? What if Natalie didn't make it? He couldn't bear the thought of losing either of them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, there was a sound. A thin, high-pitched cry that pierced through the heavy silence of the room. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening with emotion. It was the sound of life, the sound of his daughter. "She's out," Dr. Taylor announced, his voice filled with relief. "And she's doing great." The medical team quickly wrapped the baby in a blanket, bringing her over to Marcus. His hands trembled as he reached for her, his heart pounding in his chest. She was tiny, her face scrunched up and pink, her cries soft and strong all at once. "Hey there, little one," Marcus whispered, tears filling his eyes as he cradled her gently in his arms. "You're here. You made it." The overwhelming relief that washed over him was almost too much to bear. He looked down at his daughter, her tiny hands curling into fists, and then over at Natalie, who was still lying on the table, her eyes half closed. But her face softened with emotion. "Nat, she's here," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he brought the baby closer to her. "Our baby girl." Natalie's eyes fluttered open, her lips trembling as she tried to focus on the tiny face before her. "She's beautiful," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We did it." Marcus leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Natalie's forehead, his heart full to bursting. "You did it, Natty. You're incredible." For the first time since the labor had begun, Natalie felt at peace. The pain was gone, replaced by a profound sense of love and gratitude. Her body was weak, exhausted from the ordeal, but in her arms lay the reason she had fought so hard. They had made it. As Natalie lay in the recovery room, the soft hum of the machine surrounding her, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. She had come so close to losing everything, the life she had fought for, the future she had imagined. But now, here she was, with her newborn daughter safely cradled in her arms. Marcus sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as they both stared down at their baby girl. The intensity of the last few hours had left them both emotionally drained, but there was a quiet peace in the room now, a peace that had been hard-won. But beneath that peace, there was a simmering tension, an anger that Marcus couldn't shake. Natalie had nearly been dismissed, her pain ignored, her fears downplayed. If he hadn't pushed for a second opinion, if Dr. Taylor hadn't stepped in when he did, Marcus didn't want to think about how differently things could have turned out. "We came too close, Nat," Marcus said quietly, his voice low but filled with barely controlled anger. "You told them something was wrong, and they didn't listen. You should never have had to go through that." Natalie nodded, her heart heavy with the truth of his words. She had known, deep down, that something wasn't right from the beginning. But her voice hadn't been enough. It had taken hours of suffering, hours of being ignored, before anyone had truly listened. "I know," Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't expect it to be like this. I thought I'd be taken seriously." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said firmly. "To anyone." Natalie looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sadness. She knew he meant every word, but the weight of what they had endured still hung heavy in the air. They had their daughter now, and she was healthy and safe. But the journey to get here had left scars that would take time to heal. As they sat together in the quiet of the recovery room, holding their daughter close, they knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in their lives, but also the beginning of a fight for change. A fight to ensure that no other mother, no other family, would have to experience what they had, because every voice deserved to be heard. The first few days after the emergency C-section passed in a haze of relief, exhaustion, and quiet reflection. Natalie's body was still weak from the surgery, but every time she held Ava in her arms, the weight of what had happened began to lift, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. Ava was healthy and thriving, her soft coos and tiny, curious eyes filling the room with new life. But despite the joy of having their daughter, Natalie and Marcus were both struggling with the emotional fallout from the birth. The moments of panic, the dismissal of Natalie's pain, the fight to be taken seriously, it lingered. like a shadow that darkened what should have been the happiest time of their lives. Natalie sat propped up in bed, cradling Ava against her chest, as she looked out the hospital window. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the city skyline. The view was beautiful, peaceful even, but inside, she felt anything but calm. Marcus had stepped out for a moment to speak with the doctors about her recovery, but even when he was there, Natalie could feel the tension radiating from him. He had been supportive, as always, but there was an anger simmering just beneath the surface, a frustration that neither of them could shake. As if sensing her mother's unease, Ava stirred in her sleep, her tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. Natalie gently rocked her, her heart swelling with love. She had waited so long for this moment, holding her baby, feeling her warmth, knowing that they had both survived the storm. But the storm wasn't truly over. The door to the room opened quietly, and Marcus walked in, his expression softening as he saw Natalie holding their daughter. He crossed the room in a few long strides, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "How's she doing?" Marcus asked, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the quiet peace of the moment. "She's perfect," Natalie whispered, smiling down at Ava. "She's everything." Marcus reached out, gently stroking Ava's tiny hand, his face etched with a mixture of awe and sadness. "I still can't believe how close we came to losing her. And you." Natalie swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I know. I keep thinking about it. About what could have happened if you hadn't pushed for the doctor to come in." Marcus's jaw tightened, and she could see the flicker of anger return to his eyes. "It shouldn't have taken that. You shouldn't have had to suffer like that, Nat. They should have listened to you from the start." Natalie nodded, the memory of Nurse Susan's dismissive tone still fresh in her mind. "I kept telling them something wasn't right. I knew it, but no one believed me. Not until it was almost too late." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. "I trusted this hospital. I trusted the system, and they failed you. They failed us." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their shared experience hanging heavily in the air. Natalie knew Marcus was right. She had been ignored, her pain dismissed as overreaction, and it had almost cost her and Ava their lives. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern, one that affected women like her, women whose voices were too often silenced in the medical world. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, his voice quiet but determined. "I want to talk to the hospital administration. I want to make sure this never happens again. To you, to anyone." Natalie looked at him, her heart aching with both love and frustration. She knew he meant well, he always did, but part of her was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of reliving the fear, tired of the system that had almost failed her. "Do you think they'll even listen?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with doubt. "They'll have to," Marcus said, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I'm not going to let this go, not after what they put you through." Natalie nodded, though the thought of confronting the people who had dismissed her felt overwhelming. "I want to do something too," she whispered. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did. Like their pain doesn't matter." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "We'll do it together." And for the first time since the surgery, Natalie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe their voices could make a difference. 2 weeks later, Natalie and Marcus sat in the office of Mr. Jennings, the CEO of the hospital. It was a stark, sterile room, polished wood, neat rows of framed awards on the walls, and the faint hum of air conditioning in the background. The contrast between this calm, orderly space and the chaotic life-or-death moments they had endured felt jarring to Natalie. Beside Mr. Jennings sat Dr. Taylor, who had performed the emergency C-section, and nurse manager Peterson, head of the maternity ward. Marcus sat next to Natalie, his hand resting on her knee, offering silent support. Natalie took a deep breath, steadying herself for the conversation ahead. "Thank you both for coming in today," Mr. Jennings said, his voice smooth and practiced. "We've reviewed your case, and I want to start by saying that we're deeply sorry for the experience you had during Natalie's labor." Natalie glanced at Marcus, her heart pounding. Apologies were nice, but they weren't enough. They needed action. They needed change. I appreciate the apology, Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. But this isn't just about our experience. It's about the fact that my wife wasn't listened to when she was in pain. Her concerns were dismissed, and it almost cost us our child. This can't happen again. Doctor, Taylor nodded, his expression serious. I understand, Marcus. When I saw your wife's condition, I knew we needed to act fast. I'm just sorry it took so long to get to that point. Natalie shifted in her seat, her voice steady but laced with emotion. I kept telling them something was wrong. I wasn't just scared. I knew my body. I knew this wasn't normal. But it felt like no one believed me. Nurse Peterson frowned slightly, glancing at her clipboard. We've looked into Nurse Susan's conduct during your labor, and while she followed protocol, it's clear that there was a breakdown in communication. A breakdown in communication? Marcus's voice was sharp. My wife was in agony, and she was dismissed over and over again. This wasn't a communication issue, it was a failure to listen. Mr. Jennings raised a hand, his expression placating. We're not trying to excuse what happened. We understand that Natalie's concerns weren't addressed properly, and we're taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. We've already begun reviewing our training procedures, particularly when it comes to pain management and patient communication. Our staff will be undergoing additional training on how to listen and respond to patients' concerns, especially in high-stress situations like childbirth. Natalie felt a small flicker of hope at his words, but it wasn't enough. It's not just about training, she said quietly. It's about a culture where women, especially Black women, are too often dismissed when they speak about their pain. This isn't just about my experience. This is something that happens to women like me all the time. There was a moment of silence in the room, the weight of Natalie's words settling over everyone present. Mr. Jennings shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression thoughtful. You're right, Natalie, he said slowly. This is part of a larger issue, and we need to address it. We're committed to making real changes, starting with implementing new protocols to ensure that every patient's voice is heard. This includes mandatory racial bias training for all staff, as well as a review of our patient care procedures to make sure that no one is dismissed or ignored when they express concerns. Marcus exhaled, his anger still simmering, but he could see that they were being taken seriously. It was a start, a small step toward change. We'll be following up on these changes, Marcus said, his voice steady. This can't just be words on paper. We need to see real action. Mr. Jennings nodded. You have my word, Marcus. We're committed to making this right. Natalie glanced at Marcus, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't undo the trauma they had endured, but it was something. A chance to make sure that other women wouldn't have to fight so hard to be heard. As they left the office, walking through the brightly lit halls of the hospital, Natalie felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, anger, hope, and sadness. They had survived, but the fight for change wasn't over. We did it, Marcus said softly, his hand resting on the small of her back as they walked toward the exit. Natalie nodded, though her heart still ached with the weight of everything they had been through. We're just getting started. A month later, Natalie and Marcus were back at the hospital, not as patients, but as advocates. The hospital had organized a staff-wide meeting to introduce the new protocols that had been put in place as a result of Natalie's case. Marcus had been asked to speak, given his role as COO, but it was Natalie's voice that everyone in the room was waiting to hear. The auditorium was packed, filled with doctors, nurses, and administrative staff. As Natalie stood at the front of the room, facing the very people who had been responsible for her care during the most vulnerable moment of her life, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. But then she looked at Marcus, standing beside her, and she thought about Ava, about how close she had come to losing her daughter. And the fear faded, replaced by a quiet strength. This isn't easy for me to talk about, Natalie began, her voice clear but trembling slightly. But I'm standing here today because I believe we can change things. We have to change things. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. When I was in labor, I knew something was wrong. I told the nurses over and over, but no one believed me. My pain was dismissed, my concerns downplayed. And if it weren't for my husband pushing for a second opinion, I don't know if I'd be standing here today. There was a murmur in the room, and Natalie could see some of the nurses shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But she didn't stop. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about all the women who go through this, who aren't listened to when they're in pain, especially Black women. We've seen the statistics. We know that Black women are more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And part of that is because we're not taken seriously when we speak about our pain." The room was silent now, every eye on her. "I'm not here to point fingers," Natalie said, her voice softening. "I'm here to ask for change, to ask that you listen, to ask that you believe your patients when they tell you something is wrong. Because you're not just treating a body, you're caring for a person. And every person deserves to be heard." There was a long pause as her words hung in the air, and then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it was steady, growing in intensity as more and more people joined in. Natalie's heart pounded in her chest, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. Hope that this time things might actually change. Marcus stepped forward, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "You did it," he whispered, his voice filled with pride. Natalie nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "We did it." As they left the stage, walking hand in hand through the halls of the hospital, Natalie knew that their fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, but they had taken the first step. And for the first time in a long time, Natalie felt like her voice, her story, had truly made a difference. The sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting a soft golden glow on the rows of chairs set up in the auditorium. It had been a month since Natalie and Marcus's emotional speech, and in that short time, the hospital had already begun implementing the changes they had advocated for. The atmosphere within the hospital had shifted. There was a new energy, a sense of urgency that had been missing before. Nurses, doctors, and administrators alike were all part of something bigger, a movement toward patient-centered care. Natalie sat in the back of the auditorium, Ava nestled quietly in her lap as she watched Marcus take the stage. Today, he wasn't just speaking as the COO of the hospital, he was speaking as a husband, as a father, and as someone who had experienced the system's shortcomings firsthand. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "What we're doing here isn't just about fixing policies. It's about changing the culture of how we care for our patients. It's about ensuring that every voice, every concern, is heard and respected." Natalie watched as the room remained silent, everyone's attention focused on Marcus. He had always been a strong leader, but today there was a new kind of passion in his voice, one born out of personal experience. He wasn't just managing a hospital anymore. He was fighting for change, for a system that would never again dismiss someone's pain or fear. "As many of you know, my wife, Natalie, and I recently welcomed our daughter into the world," Marcus continued, his gaze flicking toward Natalie and Ava for a moment before returning to the crowd. "But that experience wasn't what we had hoped it would be. Natalie's pain, her concerns were ignored. We almost lost both her and our daughter because the system we trusted didn't listen." There were murmurs throughout the room, but Marcus pressed on. "I'm not telling you this to lay blame," Marcus said, his voice softening. "I'm telling you this because it's a reminder of how important our work is. When we dismiss our patients' voices, we fail them. And we cannot afford to fail anyone." Natalie felt a lump form in her throat as Marcus spoke. His words echoed her own feelings, her own experiences. But now, instead of fear or anger, she felt a sense of hope. Hope that the hospital was finally listening, that real change was happening. "Our new protocols are just the beginning," Marcus continued. "We're implementing mandatory racial bias training for all staff, ensuring that we are addressing the disparities in maternal care that affect women of color. We are revising our pain management procedures to ensure that no one's concerns are ever dismissed again. And we are creating a task force to monitor these changes, to hold us accountable for the promises we're making here today." There was a soft round of applause from the audience, and Natalie felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. This was the future they had fought for, the future Ava deserved. "As we move forward," Marcus said, his voice rising with conviction, "I ask each of you to take this responsibility seriously, to remember that behind every patient is a person, a family, who trusts you with their lives. Let's make sure we honor that trust." The applause was louder this time, and as Marcus stepped down from the stage, he made his way toward Natalie, his eyes softening as they locked on her and Ava. When he reached them, he leaned down and kissed the top of Ava's head before sitting beside Natalie. "You were amazing," Natalie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "We're doing it, Nat. We're really making a difference." Natalie nodded, her heart full. She glanced down at Ava, who was fast asleep in her arms, and felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the future they were building for their daughter, for every woman who would walk through the hospital doors, for every voice that had gone unheard for too long. 2 weeks after Marcus's speech, the hospital was already seeing the impact of the new protocols. Nurses and doctors alike were undergoing intensive racial bias training, and the maternity ward had introduced new guidelines for listening and responding to patient concerns. There was a palpable difference in the air. Patients were no longer just names on charts. They were individuals whose voices mattered. Natalie was sitting in one of the hospital's consultation rooms for her postnatal checkup. As she waited for the doctor to arrive, she thought about how much had changed since that traumatic day when Ava was born. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the emotions were still fresh in her mind. When the door opened, a new face greeted her, a young nurse named Ashley, who introduced herself with a warm smile. "Hi, Mrs. Ross," Ashley said, her voice gentle. "I'll be helping you today. How are you and Ava doing?" "We're doing well," Natalie said, returning the smile. "She's growing fast?" Ashley nodded, her eyes flicking toward the sleeping baby in the carrier beside Natalie. "That's wonderful to hear. I just want to check in and make sure you're feeling okay, both physically and emotionally. It's important to us that you feel supported." Natalie blinked, a little surprised by the openness in Ashley's tone. She had been to dozens of doctor appointments over the years, but never had she felt so directly asked about her emotional well-being. I'm doing better," Natalie admitted, a slight smile playing on her lips. "It was rough for a while, but things are getting easier." "That's good," Ashley said, making notes on the chart. "And if there's ever anything you need to talk about, we're here. Whether it's physical recovery or emotional support, we want to make sure you feel heard." Those words, "feel heard," hit Natalie like a wave. For so long, she had fought to be listened to have her pain acknowledged. And now, hearing those words from a nurse felt like validation. It felt like progress. "Thank you," Natalie said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "That means a lot." After the checkup, Natalie stepped out into the hallway, the weight of her past fears lifting as she walked toward the exit. As she passed by the maternity ward, she noticed something new, a large poster hanging on the wall featuring the hospital's new slogan, "Every voice matters. Every patient heard." Natalie stopped in her tracks, staring at the words that now defined the hospital's mission. She had never imagined that her own experience, her pain, her fear, would lead to something so tangible, so real. But there it was, in bold letters for everyone to see. Marcus met her at the entrance, his eyes catching hers as he saw the tears brimming in her eyes. "You okay?" he asked softly, placing a gentle hand on her back. Natalie nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "Yeah, I'm just proud of what we've done." "We've come a long way," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "And we're not done yet." As they walked out of the hospital together, Natalie felt the sun on her face and took a deep breath, letting the warmth fill her. They were leaving behind the fear, the doubt, the trauma, but more importantly, they were carrying with them the strength they had found in each other and in themselves. 6 months later, the hospital had become a beacon of hope and progress. The The changes implemented after Natalie's experience had inspired other hospitals in the region to take a closer look at their own practices, and many had begun following suit. Marcus was frequently invited to speak at conferences, sharing the lessons learned and the protocols they had put in place. But for Natalie, the most significant change was the one she saw every day in the maternity ward. The staff had transformed. Nurses and doctors were actively listening to their patients, engaging in conversations about their pain, their fears, and their needs. There was no more dismissal, no more downplaying of concerns. Every voice mattered. One afternoon, Natalie found herself back at the hospital, this time volunteering as part of a new mother's support group that she and Marcus had helped organize. The group was small but growing. Women who had gone through difficult pregnancies, traumatic births, or just wanted a safe space to share their stories. Natalie sat in the circle, listening as one of the women, Jasmine, shared her experience with tears in her eyes. "I didn't think anyone would listen to me," Jasmine said, her voice trembling. "But this time they did. They heard me, and because of that, I didn't have to go through what I went through before." Natalie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was why she had fought so hard. For women like Jasmine, for women like her, who had been through the system and come out the other side feeling invisible. But now they were visible. They were heard. As the meeting came to an end, Natalie gathered her things and headed toward the exit, her heart light. She had found her purpose, not just as a mother, but as an advocate. Her voice, once silenced by fear and dismissal, had become a powerful force for change. Outside, Marcus was waiting for her, Ava on his hip, her chubby arms reaching out toward her mother. Natalie laughed, scooping her daughter up and kissing her soft cheek. "How was the meeting?" Marcus asked, smiling at the sight of them together. "It was amazing," Natalie said, her voice filled with joy. "It's incredible to see how much has changed." Marcus nodded, his eyes softening. "We've come a long way, Nat. And it's because of you." Natalie shook her head, glancing down at Ava. "It's because of her. She's the reason we fought so hard." They walked hand in hand down the street, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows on the pavement. It had been a long journey, full of pain and heartache, but also love and triumph. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that they had made a difference. For their daughter, for every mother, for every voice. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, advocating for change, and spreading awareness about important issues. Feel free to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.